Over the past week, stock markets across the world have been convulsed by a fear that some of the biggest countries in the world won't be able to pay back their enormous public debts. The latest teetering domino is Italy. 50% of Italy's debt is held by overseas investors, and that means if Italy defaults, the virus will spread. Europe correspondent Emma Alberici reports from Rome.
It's the epicentre of the economic earthquake shaking Europe, with Italy's public debt at 120% of its GDP and an economy that's at a standstill. The country can't even afford to pay back the interest on its loans. Once upon a time, it could devalue its currency and raise money by selling more of its well-known brands overseas, but it can't do that anymore. Its fortunes or otherwise are tied to the other 16 countries who also use the euro.
The Italian government and the European governments have got to find a way of dealing with the Italian problem. Otherwise, the euro is in serious trouble.
Does the Italian government have a credible plan to increase economic growth?
At the moment, no.
First came Greece, then Ireland and Portugal. But now the prospect of a fatal tremor wiping out Italy's financial future is something the markets just can't bear. This economy is the third largest in the Eurozone. To give you some idea of its relative size, take Greece, Ireland and Portugal, put them together and double it, and you get somewhere close. But even more significant than that is the Italian bond market. After the US and Japan, the government here issues more bonds than anyone else in the world. It currently owes international investors around $3 trillion. The fear on global markets is that in the event of a default, none of the European institutions have the financial muscle to bail Italy out. Chino fears for his son's future. Even after graduating from university, he can't find a job. He's one of the 30% or so of young Italians out of work.
Of my son's class, 20 of them went to university, but only 3 of them found work. One because he went to China, and the other 2 got jobs in international banks in Brussels. Those who found jobs in Italy could only get temporary work for 3 or 6 months. There is no job security in Italy.
The Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, has vowed to raise $67 billion over the next 2 years by privatising public services and cutting government spending. In true Berlusconi style, he told the Italian people that the markets have overreacted and not to worry because the crisis will be over soon.
Le borse sono come un orologio rotto.
The markets are like a broken watch. Twice a day they'll tell you the right time. The rest of the time, it's wrong. Everyone should know that by now. If I had substantial savings put aside, I would be investing that money in my businesses, which have always and still provide a very good return on investment.
James Walston is Professor of International Relations at the American University of Rome. For more than 30 years, he's been studying an economy so mired in tax abuse, corruption and red tape that businesses other than those within the Berlusconi family itself no longer want to invest here.
Berlusconi, in his recent speech in which he addressed the Italian economy and said practically everything was fine, when he was heckled about not knowing anything about the stock exchange, he said, "I'll have you know that I am a businessman fighting in the trenches defending my 3 companies quoted in the stock exchange." I thought he was Prime Minister of Italy first.
The financial markets aren't the only ones putting pressure on Rome. EU headquarters in Brussels has warned the government to better manage its economy or go it alone. Outside the Italian parliament, this man is on a hunger strike. He hasn't eaten anything for 67 days. Gaetano Ferrieri and his supporters want to raise awareness about a government that's about to impose austerity on the public while itself pocketing the highest levels of wages and perks in Europe.
Even on a humanitarian level, no one has come out to ask how I'm going. The politicians have ignored us completely. As far as the political class is concerned, the people should just pay their taxes and stay silent.
Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, the government here has been telling the people that everything's fine, that Italy is in a better position than most to weather the financial storm. And in some respects, that's true. Aside from interest payments on the country's spiralling debt, income in Italy is actually higher than spending. So the problem's not so much a fiscal one. Commentators complain more of a lack of leadership, that Silvio Berlusconi himself is distracted from the task. Since taking office, he's faced no fewer than 23 lawsuits against him.
Berlusconi, over the last few years, has been dealing much more with his own problems, both his sexual problems and his economic problems, his business problems, changing the laws in order to deal with that, and not moving into reforms for the economy.
10 years ago, David Lane wrote a piece for The Economist magazine claiming that Silvio Berlusconi was unfit to govern Italy. He hasn't changed his mind. Given now that Rome has taken the EU to the brink of economic collapse, it's time, he says, for Brussels to seize control of Italy's budget as well as the budgets of all the other countries that use the euro.
It's not political unity that's needed. What is needed is fiscal unification.
For now at least, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is buying Italian bonds to buy time and calm the markets. The Bank of Italy is one of the ECB's biggest shareholders, so this tactic is hardly sustainable in the long or the short term.
Emma Alberici reporting from Rome, and with me in the studio is Stephen Long, who's been covering the financial crisis for us. Stephen, why should we in Australia care about what's happening in Italy or indeed Europe, our major trading partners in Asia? What does it matter to us?
Well, it will hit some of those major trading partners, Lee. Some of the major markets for China are in Europe, and if Chinese exports dwindle, then inevitably that will hit Australian commodity exports. That's the first order hit. The second is that this may cause another global credit squeeze, and that would crimp Australian growth also. OK, so how does Europe get out of this mess that it's in? There's no easy answer. One of the potential remedies that is being discussed is to replace these troubled individual nation-state bonds with one Eurozone bond, which markets could have confidence in because it would be backed by the entire Eurozone. The question is there the political will to do that? Certainly, as Emma suggested in her piece, the option that's being pursued now of the European Central Bank buying bonds is no answer. Potentially, if it bought enough bonds to make a difference, you'd be placing the central bank at risk itself. What do you make, just across the Atlantic, in the US, of this pledge by the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates on hold at zero until at least 2013? Clearly it's caused big rallies on the markets, but if you step back and think about it, Lee, it's really no cause for optimism. This is quite extraordinary. A central bank committing to keep interest rates at zero for 2 years is telling you that the Federal Reserve, the world's most powerful central bank, thinks that the world's major economy, the United States, is going to be stagnant for at least the next 2 years, with high unemployment, low wages growth, no threat of inflation. That is actually a worrying sign, despite the fact that it has caused the markets to rally. Now, those interest rates have been at zero for something like 30 months now, and it hasn't really caused any significant recovery in the United States. So once the markets step back and think about this, you might see that people see that this is not really a cause for great hope. Wayne Swan, the Australian Treasurer, has been saying this week that the Gillard government will still deliver a return to surplus in Australia in 2012-2013, despite, the changing global circumstances. Is that sound economic management? It's not sound economic management really, and it also isn't an assurance that Wayne Swan can categorically give, because it'll be out of Wayne Swan's hands and the government's hands. Australia is captive to these international events. We will be in deficit no matter what the government wants to do if things get bad enough overseas. If they don't, we may achieve a surplus, but it would make no sense to try to keep the budget in surplus merely to meet a political goal or a political promise if things get bad overseas. The unemployment rate would go up. That would naturally drive us into deficit, and there may be a case for more fiscal stimulus in any case. So I just don't think that the government's in any position to give any categorical assurances, and we are just at the whim of these international forces. It's likely to be a wild ride.
Which means I'll be having your company probably a little bit more. Stephen Long, Thank you very much.
You're welcome.